The Goodfellas put the mob's accountant on screen. The real version helped murder 2 rival bosses in 1 year, bribed a foreign dictator for control of Havana's casinos, and walked free from 50 years in organized crime with a 2-month gambling conviction. This is why the real Meyer Lansky story is worse than the Goodfellas. Section 1. The accountant nobody could touch. Meyer Lansky was 9 years old when his family left Grodno in 1911, traveling through the port of Odessa to reach a country where his name would eventually be shortened, anglicized, and made famous in courtrooms from New York to Miami. His father Max had gone 2 years ahead, working the garment trade in Brooklyn, while the rest of the family waited out conditions that had become impossible to ignore. Grodno sat inside the Pale of Settlement, the region of the Russian Empire, where Jewish families were legally permitted to reside, and where the machinery of the state regularly reminded them of the fragility of that permission. The pogroms that swept through the Pale in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not spontaneous eruptions of mob violence, though they were sometimes described that way. They were organized. Local authorities looked the other way, or actively participated, and Jewish communities learned quickly that the protection of the law was a fiction that applied to other people. The Lansky family had watched this long enough. In 1909, Max went first. In 1911, Meyer, his mother, and his younger brother Jacob followed. They came with almost nothing into one of the most densely packed neighborhoods on Earth. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1911 was holding more people per square block than almost anywhere in the industrialized world. Tenement buildings stacked families on top of families. Hallways smelled of coal and cooking, and the streets outside belonged to whoever was willing to take them. Yiddish was the operating language of the neighborhood, but the neighborhood itself was contested terrain. Italian gangs, Irish gangs, and Jewish gangs each claimed different blocks and different rackets, and the boundaries between them were enforced in the most direct way available to young men with no money and no institutional backing. The family settled first in Brownsville in Brooklyn, then moved to the Lower East Side, where Max worked his trade, and Meyer began school in a city that bore no resemblance to anything he had grown up with. What distinguished Meyer Lansky from the start, according to everyone who later described his early years, was a specific facility with numbers. He was not physically imposing. He never was. Throughout his entire career, he stood roughly 5 feet 4 inches tall and moved through the world quietly, in a way that people who met him sometimes found surprising when they learned who he was. His daughter Sandra later described a father who carried himself without the swagger the film versions of organized crime had made audiences expect. What he had instead was patience, calculation, and an early understanding of something that most street-level criminals never grasped: that violence was a tool with costs, and that money managed carefully could accomplish what violence accomplished, but without the exposure. He left school a few weeks before his 15th birthday to work as an apprentice in a tool and die shop. That same year, records show, he was already being charged with felonious assault and disorderly conduct. The two facts sit side by side without obvious contradiction. The shop work was real, so was what was happening in the streets after hours. By 1918, Lansky and a boy named Benjamin Siegel were running floating dice games on the corners and in back rooms around the Lower East Side. Siegel was 2 years younger than Lansky, and almost everything Lansky was not: loud, impulsive, physically fearless, to the point of what several people who knew him later called a clinical inability to register danger. The two of them found each other, according to Lansky's own account, on a street corner when they were both teenagers, and recognized something useful in the other almost immediately. Siegel could intimidate, Lansky could count. The combination worked. The encounter with Charles Luciano came around the same period, somewhere in the mid to late teens, on the streets of the Lower East Side. Luciano was running a small operation at the time that amounted to extorting Jewish kids for protection money on their way home from school, an activity that reflected both his available options and the ethnic logic of the neighborhood's gang structure. When he stopped Lansky and made his demand, the version of events that Lansky himself later endorsed described a simple refusal. Luciano, by most accounts of the encounter, walked away from it with something closer to respect than anger. He had been sizing up the neighborhood for whoever showed real nerve, and Lansky had shown it. The partnership that followed would last for the rest of both their lives, and would eventually reshape how organized crime operated across the entire country. What Luciano brought that Lansky and Siegel could not provide on their own was a connection to the Italian underworld structure that was already consolidating power throughout New York. The major gangs of the era were ethnically organized and ethnically exclusive, with Jewish and Italian operations running parallel to each other rather than together. Luciano understood, earlier than most of his contemporaries, that the ethnic boundary was a business liability. Lansky understood the same thing from the other side. A Jewish gang, however capable, would always be operating outside the structure that controlled the most territory and the most police relationships. The alliance between Lansky, Siegel, and Luciano was not sentiment. It was leverage, and both sides knew it. By the early 1920s, the three of them had moved from small-scale street operations into something more organized. They were stealing and reselling cars, helping bootleggers disguise their vehicles, running protection for liquor shipments, and building the network of relationships that the beginning of Prohibition in 1920 would suddenly make enormously valuable. Prohibition did not create organized crime in America. What it did was transform it, the way a sudden and enormous government contract transforms a small manufacturer into a large one. The demand for illegal alcohol was immediate and essentially universal. The profit margins were extraordinary, and the government's attempt to enforce the law created a premium on anyone who could supply the product at scale with reliable distribution. Lansky and Siegel formalized their partnership into what became known as the Bugs and Meyer mob, a name that reflected their two personalities accurately enough. Siegel was the volatile one, quick to escalate, capable of genuine cruelty in a way that people around him found useful, but also exhausting to manage. Lansky was the organizer, the one who ran the numbers and made the decisions about where money went and how exposure was minimized. The gang's membership drew from the same Jewish immigrant neighborhood that had produced both of them. Meyer's brother Jacob, a man named Samuel Levine, Joseph Stocker, and others whose names would surface and resurface throughout decades of federal investigation. What the Bugs and Meyer mob offered the larger bootlegging ecosystem, beyond its own rum-running operation, was something more specific. It rented out violence. Bootlegging operations across the northeastern states hired the gang to protect shipments, resolve disputes with competitors, and eliminate people who had become problems. The rate was reportedly $100 a day per man, though the precise fee structure was not something anyone bothered to publish. This made the Bugs and Meyer mob, in functional terms, a murder-for-hire operation wrapped inside a bootlegging business. It was the structure that would later be recognized as the direct organizational predecessor to Murder Incorporated, the centralized killing apparatus that the National Crime Syndicate would formalize in the 1930s. The logic was the same: outsource the violence, keep it at a remove from the principals who ordered it, and charge a fee that reflects the risk. Lansky understood this, not as cruelty, but as accounting. Violence was a service with a market price, and providing it professionally, through people who could be trusted not to talk, was a business like any other business. The man who clarified this understanding most forcefully was Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was already the most sophisticated criminal mind in New York when Lansky encountered him. A gambler and financier who had organized bootlegging operations with the same methodical discipline he brought to everything else, and who had understood long before most of his contemporaries that the real money in crime was not in committing crimes, but in providing the infrastructure that allowed others to commit them at scale. Rothstein saw in Lansky what he recognized in himself: a man who thought in systems rather than individual transactions, who was interested in the logic beneath events rather than the surface drama of them. He became Lansky's informal mentor, directing him toward odds-based gambling as the most sustainable long-term criminal enterprise, because the house always wins over time, and a house that cannot be shut down by law enforcement wins even better. Rothstein died in November 1928, shot during a card game at the Park Central Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, in a dispute over a gambling debt. The murder was never officially solved. By then, Lansky had absorbed everything Rothstein had to teach him, and the Bugs and Meyer mob had grown into one of the recognized major bootlegging networks in the northeastern United States, among a group that sources from the period described as the Big Seven. The organization was not just making money. It was building the relational infrastructure that would allow Lansky and Luciano to do something far more ambitious in the years immediately ahead. What the films and the television versions of this period have consistently flattened into a simple origin story: a couple of street kids who got lucky during Prohibition, misses the structural reality of what Lansky was building from the very beginning. The Bugs and Meyer mob's willingness to work across ethnic lines was unusual. The decision to provide violence as a contracted service, rather than simply using it for their own purposes, was unusual. The cultivation of a mentor like Rothstein and the application of his financial thinking to criminal enterprise was unusual. And the arrangement with Luciano, which gave a Jewish gang access to the political and judicial relationships that the Italian networks had spent a generation cultivating, was the kind of move that required a specific understanding of where actual power was located. Lansky was not yet 30 years old by the end of the 1920s, and he had already established the method he would use for the next 5 decades. Stay behind the people who attract attention, manage the money for the people who generate it, and build a network of obligations so deep and so wide that no single prosecution could reach its center. He was the brains, and Siegel was the violence, as people around them always described it. But the more precise formulation is that Lansky was the organization, and everything else was a component of it. The Lower East Side had taught him that institutions could not be relied upon to protect anyone who looked like him, and so he built his own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, Lansky spent the 1920s building the most violent Jewish gang in New York. Then he used it to help murder 2 sitting Mafia bosses in the same year. Section 2. 2 bosses, 1 year, 1 plan, April 15, 1931, was a Tuesday. Joe Masseria arrived at the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant on West 15th Street in Coney Island in his armored car, accompanied by 2 bodyguards, and sat down to lunch with the man he trusted most in the world. By the time the afternoon was over, Masseria was dead on the restaurant floor with 6 bullets in him, and the structure of American organized crime had been permanently altered. Lucky Luciano had excused himself to use the restroom, and the 4 gunmen who materialized almost immediately afterward found a man who had not yet registered what was happening. The killers fired wildly enough that 14 bullets struck the walls and fixtures of the restaurant. 6 of them struck Masseria, 2 entered his head, and 1 pierced his heart. His bodyguards had vanished. The restaurant owner's mother-in-law was found bending over the body when police arrived. Nobody else in the building could offer a useful description of the shooters, which was not an accident. The Castellamarese War had been running for just over a year at that point, a bloody and expensive conflict between Masseria's faction and a rival operation led by Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian-born boss who had built a substantial criminal organization in Brooklyn and saw himself as the natural heir to whatever emerged from the wreckage. The war had been costly for everyone involved. Men were dying on both sides. Police attention was elevated. Bootlegging revenues were being disrupted by the constant instability, and the younger generation of operators on both sides had grown increasingly impatient with 2 old men whose stubbornness was costing the rest of the organization money. Luciano had been working both angles for months, negotiating secretly with Maranzano while remaining in Masseria's camp, calculating the moment when the switch would produce maximum advantage. When he finally moved, the plan he executed bore the clear influence of the man who had been his strategic partner since they were teenagers on the Lower East Side. Lansky's specific contribution to the Masseria killing is a matter of some debate in the historical record, as many things involving him are, because Lansky spent his career ensuring that his specific contributions were difficult to trace. What the available record establishes is that the gunmen who entered the Nuova Villa Tamaro that afternoon included Bugsy Siegel, alongside Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis. Siegel was Lansky's man in the most direct sense possible. They had operated as partners since their teenage years, and Siegel did not take major assignments from anyone else without Lansky's awareness. The murder was organized, not improvised, and the planning that produced it reflected the kind of operational thinking that Lansky had been applying to the Bugs and Meyer mob's murder-for-hire work for most of the previous decade. Masseria's death solved one problem and immediately created another. Maranzano moved quickly to declare himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, an old-world title that carried real meaning within the traditional Sicilian framework, and essentially no meaning at all to the people like Luciano and Lansky, who had built their careers on the proposition that the ethnic rigidities of the old framework were a liability to be worked around. Maranzano organized the New York families into the five-family structure that still provides the basic architecture of the city's organized crime to this day, installed Luciano as the head of Masseria's former operation, and then almost immediately began plotting to have Luciano killed. His objection to Luciano was partly personal and partly structural. Luciano's alliance with Jewish gangsters offended Maranzano's Sicilian traditionalism, and that alliance was, in practical terms, Lansky. Getting rid of Luciano would have meant dismantling the arrangement that gave the Italian families access to the most capable enforcement and financial apparatus in the city. What saved Luciano's life was information, and the information came through Tommy Lucchese, one of Maranzano's own lieutenants, who had decided that his own future was better served by the emerging order than by the existing one. Lucchese got word to Luciano that Maranzano had already hired an Irish freelance killer named Vincent Call, known in the press as Mad Dog Call, to handle the job. Maranzano had actually scheduled the meeting with Luciano on the same afternoon that Call was due to arrive, intending to have Luciano murdered in his own office, while the whole thing could plausibly be attributed to whatever chaos generally surrounded Call's operations. Luciano learned about the plan and moved first. The mechanics of the September 10th operation at 230 Park Avenue were a direct product of Lansky and Siegel's specific capabilities. Maranzano's office was on the 9th floor of what was then the New York Central Building, a prestigious midtown address that he used to project an image of legitimate business activity. He was known to travel with substantial security and drove a bulletproof Cadillac. The key vulnerability that Luciano's people identified was something Lansky understood immediately. Maranzano was already expecting federal tax agents. The IRS had been building a case against him, and he had instructed his bodyguards not to carry firearms to the office, specifically because he anticipated an audit visit at any moment. A team of men who could present themselves plausibly as government agents would walk straight through his defenses. Luciano turned to Lansky and Siegel for the team. The specific logic was straightforward. Maranzano's people did not know the Jewish gangsters associated with Lansky's network the way they knew the Italian faces in Luciano's orbit. 4 men were selected whose appearances were unfamiliar to Maranzano's security. On the afternoon of September 10th, they entered the building, went up to the 9th floor, produced what appeared to be badges, and forced the waiting room full of Maranzano's men against the wall. Tommy Lucchese, who was present that day under the cover of a legitimate visit, identified Maranzano with a gesture. One of the assassins forced Maranzano into his private office. What followed was determined by the sounds that came through the closed door. Maranzano was stabbed 4 times in the chest, stomach, and face. He was strangled. Then he was shot 6 times at close range. The killers left through the stairwell and were gone before the police arrived. The 2 murders had occurred within 5 months of each other. 2 sitting bosses of the New York underworld, eliminated in the same calendar year by the same alliance of men, and Lansky's fingerprints were on both operations without his name appearing in any official account of either. This was the pattern he would maintain for the next 5 decades, present at the architecture of major events, invisible in the documentation of them. What came after the 2 murders was the structure that Lansky and Luciano had been building toward since at least the Atlantic City Conference of May 1929. That summit, held at the President Hotel in Atlantic City over several days in mid-May and organized by Luciano with Lansky's direct involvement, had brought together crime figures from across the country to discuss a set of problems that were fundamentally business problems. The gang wars were costing money, the violence was attracting federal attention, and the existing ethnic divisions between organizations were preventing the kind of economies of scale that would make everyone richer. Al Capone was there, already the most famous criminal in the country, and already beginning to understand that fame was a business liability. Johnny Torrio attended, Capone's former mentor, and one of the few figures in the room old enough to have watched the entire Prohibition era unfold. Frank Costello was present. The consensus that emerged from those discussions was the conceptual foundation for what was formalized over the years between 1931 and 1934 as the National Crime Syndicate. The Commission, as its governing structure came to be known, was a body without precedent in American criminal history. It was not a gang, it was not a family. It was a board of directors for an industry, with territorial agreements that functioned like market divisions, dispute resolution mechanisms that replaced freelance violence with structured arbitration, and a shared enforcement apparatus that pooled the capabilities of multiple organizations. The 5 New York families each held a seat. Other major regional operations were represented. Jewish figures like Lansky operated as essential partners rather than subordinates, contributing financial management and the enforcement capabilities of the Bugs and Meyer network in exchange for a stake in the income streams the whole arrangement generated. Lansky's specific position within this structure was unusual in ways that the film versions of the period have consistently failed to capture. He was never a made member of the Italian families. The rules that governed membership in those organizations required Sicilian or Italian lineage, and Lansky had neither. He was, formally speaking, an associate, a status that in the traditional hierarchy implied a lower tier of trust and access. In practice, his relationship with Luciano and his demonstrated value to the enterprise gave him a position that no formal title could have accurately described. He was the man who managed the money, who designed the laundering structures, who organized the offshore accounts that began appearing in Swiss banks as early as 1932. He was the person that bosses called when they needed something done carefully, rather than just violently. That function made him irreplaceable in a way that no amount of formal rank could have produced. The remark attributed to Lansky about the syndicate being bigger than United States Steel was made in this period, in reference to the scale of the combined operation at its height. U.S. Steel was at the time one of the largest corporations in the world by capitalization, and the comparison was not entirely hyperbole. The combined revenues flowing through the National Crime Syndicate's various operations in gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and related enterprises across the country were genuinely staggering in their aggregate, even if no reliable audit of them has ever been possible. The point of the comparison was precisely that. Lansky was describing what he and Luciano had built, not as a gang, but as an industry, subject to the same economic logic as any other large-scale enterprise, and requiring the same kind of management discipline to sustain. The films that have tried to depict this period, including the Godfather films that drew directly on Lansky's history for the character of Hyman Roth, capture the atmosphere and some of the personalities well enough. What they cannot fully convey is the specific intellectual contribution that Lansky made to each of the major structural changes in American organized crime during the 1930s. The decision to use Jewish hitmen who were unknown to Maranzano's security was an operational insight born from decades of managing the Bugs and Meyer mob's contract violence work. The offshore laundering through Swiss accounts, beginning almost immediately after the syndicate was formalized, was financial architecture that predated by decades the methods that later money laundering prosecutions would make famous. The multi-ethnic structure of the commission itself was, at its foundation, an idea that Luciano championed, and Lansky had been living out since his teenage years on the Lower East Side. By 1934, when the formal structure of the National Crime Syndicate was settled, Lansky was 32 years old. He had helped engineer the deaths of the 2 most powerful men in American organized crime within the same year, had structured the financial operations of the resulting organization, and had done all of it without a single serious criminal charge attached to his name. The pattern was set. The next 40 years would follow it almost without variation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, with 2 bosses dead and the syndicate built, Lansky turned his attention to something more durable than murder, a gambling empire that would stretch from Florida to Cuba to the Nevada desert. Section 3. The House Always Wins. The Accountant Always Hides Prohibition ended in December 1933, and within months, Meyer Lansky had already identified what came next. The bootlegging revenues were finished. Gambling was not. The reasoning was straightforward for anyone who thought in the terms Lansky did. Alcohol had been a temporary market created by a temporary law, and its enormous profitability had always depended on the government's willingness to maintain an unenforceable ban. Gambling was different. The appetite for it was permanent. The mathematical structure of casino games guaranteed profit to whoever ran them honestly, and the law's relationship to it varied enough from state to state and county to county that a sufficiently organized operation could always find territory where the political ground was workable. Arnold Rothstein had understood this before Lansky, and Lansky had absorbed the lesson completely. What he added to it was scale, geographic distribution, and a financial architecture sophisticated enough to make the money effectively invisible once it left the casino floor. Florida was the first serious expansion. By the mid-1930s, Lansky had identified Broward County, the stretch of South Florida running between Miami and Fort Lauderdale, as the kind of jurisdiction where the right relationships with local law enforcement could sustain a gambling operation indefinitely. Hallandale Beach, a small farming town on Broward Boulevard, became the center of it. The county sheriff at the time, Walter Clark, was by various accounts not merely tolerant of the illegal establishments that opened along the boulevard, but held a financial stake in at least one of them. That arrangement was not unique to Broward County or to Lansky's operations, but Lansky managed it with a discipline that kept the whole enterprise running through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, without the kind of violent disruption that had plagued earlier underworld gambling ventures in other cities. The establishments Lansky ran in Hallandale were known as carpet joints, a term that distinguished them from the rougher clip joints that gave illegal gambling its worst reputation. The distinction mattered to Lansky for reasons that were entirely commercial. A clip joint, where games were rigged against the customer, generated short-term revenue at the cost of long-term reputation. Customers who felt cheated did not return, and they told other people. Lansky's operations ran honest games, by the standards available in that era, meaning the house advantage came from the actual mathematical structure of the games, rather than from manipulation of outcomes. This was unusual enough to function as a selling point. Wealthy Floridians and tourists, who might otherwise have avoided illegal gambling, found their way to Lansky's rooms because the word was that the games were fair. The house edge, applied consistently over thousands of hands and spins, generated a profit without any additional assistance. Lansky understood odds-based probability well enough to know that the mathematics of a properly run casino was already the most reliable income stream in existence. Cheating was not just ethically questionable, it was economically unnecessary. His brother Jake arrived in South Florida in 1933 and took a position running the day-to-day operations of the Broward County establishments, fronting for Meyer in a role that allowed the senior Lansky to maintain the distance he preferred from anything that might generate a paper trail. The Colonial Inn in Hallandale, which opened in December 1945, became one of the most elaborately appointed illegal gambling establishments in the eastern United States, with entertainment imported from New York and a clientele that included both organized crime figures and the kind of legitimate wealthy visitors who preferred not to think too carefully about who owned the room. The mob had an explicit rule for Broward County: no violence. The gambling was too lucrative to disrupt with the kind of conflicts that would have drawn federal attention. It was one of the few territories in Lansky's career where the prohibition on killing was enforced, not by morality, but by profit calculation, which made it, in practice, the most reliably enforced rule he ever operated under. Al Capone's federal conviction for tax evasion in 1931 had registered on Lansky as a practical lesson rather than a distant cautionary tale. Capone had accumulated enormous wealth and left enormous traces of it. The government, unable to prove the crimes that generated the money, had simply proven that the money existed and that no taxes had been paid on it. Lansky's response to this object lesson began almost immediately and accelerated after 1934, when Switzerland's new Banking Act codified secrecy protections for numbered accounts in a way that made the identity of account holders effectively impossible for foreign governments to obtain. As early as 1932, Lansky had already begun moving money from his New Orleans operations into Swiss accounts. The 1934 law did not create the opportunity, it formalized and protected one he had already begun using. The system he built around Swiss banking was more architecturally complex than the simple act of depositing money abroad. Money moved from gambling operations through a chain of shell companies, with no single link in the chain carrying enough of the picture to expose the full structure. Frontmen held nominal ownership of properties that Lansky actually controlled. Tax returns were filed showing income consistent with a modest, legitimate lifestyle, because Lansky genuinely lived that way in the visible portion of his existence. He did not build the mansion or drive the car that would have invited questions about where the money came from. The bulk of the profit went offshore through channels specifically designed to fragment and obscure its path. Eventually, he purchased an offshore bank in Switzerland outright, which allowed him to move money through an institution he controlled, rather than one he was simply a customer of. The sophistication of this arrangement was not matched by American law enforcement's investigative tools for decades, which is precisely why it worked for as long as it did. The Saratoga Springs operation in upstate New York was a different model from Florida, built around the racing season rather than year-round casino gambling. Lansky partnered with Frank Costello and Joe Adonis to convert a restaurant called the Lido Venice into the Piping Rock Club in 1932, one of the largest illegal casinos of its era. The Piping Rock ran 12 roulette wheels, 3 craps tables, and a card table, and brought in entertainment comparable to anything operating legally in the country. Saratoga's horse racing season drew exactly the kind of wealthy, gambling-inclined clientele that a carpet joint required. The operation ran through the 1940s and produced substantial revenue before finally drawing enough law enforcement attention to become untenable. It was the Saratoga Springs gambling conviction in 1953 that produced the only real jail time of Lansky's career: 2 months. Las Vegas emerged as the next frontier, while Lansky's Florida and New York operations were still running at full capacity. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, a fact that the syndicate's leadership had noted without immediately acting on, partly because the state's sparse population and remote geography made it seem like a limited market. Lansky's understanding of the potential changed in the mid-1940s when he grasped that Las Vegas was not competing with other cities for residents but for visitors, and that a gambling destination organized around tourism could generate revenues that had no natural ceiling. In early 1945, Siegel moved through Las Vegas on Lansky's behalf, purchasing the El Cortez Casino in downtown Las Vegas for $600,000 with a group of syndicate partners that included Gus Greenbaum, Davy Berman, and Mo Sedway. The El Cortez purchase was preliminary. The larger investment came when Siegel identified a stalled construction project on what was then the undeveloped southern stretch of Las Vegas Boulevard, and saw in it the hotel that would define his vision of what the city could become. The property belonged to a Hollywood entertainment entrepreneur named Billy Wilkerson, who had run out of money. Siegel, with Lansky's backing, took over the project. It would be called the Flamingo. What followed was one of the most expensive disasters in the history of organized crime investment, and it produced one of the most revealing episodes in Lansky's entire career. The Flamingo's construction budget started at roughly $1.5 million. By the time the hotel opened on December 26, 1946, with Jimmy Durante performing at the opening, costs had reached $6 million, and the building was still unfinished. Siegel had sourced expensive materials through the Mexican black market when domestic supplies were tight after the war, bringing in marble and decorative woods at prices that shocked the syndicate investors who were watching the numbers. The opening was a public failure. The hotel's rooms were not ready, the casino lost money in its first weeks, and the event that was supposed to announce Las Vegas as a destination managed mainly to announce that Siegel's management of large-scale construction was a catastrophe. The cost overruns alone might have been survivable. What made Siegel's position untenable was the evidence, gathered from various sources within the syndicate, that he had been skimming the construction budget for his own benefit, routing funds to European accounts through his girlfriend Virginia Hill. The syndicate's major investors, which included figures from several crime families beyond Lansky's immediate circle, gathered in Havana in December 1946 at a conference Lansky helped organize at the Hotel Nacional, and the consensus that emerged from those conversations was that Siegel's position had become a liability. Lansky's precise role in the decision has been debated in every serious account of the period. He did not order the killing. The weight of the historical evidence suggests he did not prevent it, and could not have done so even if he had tried, because by December 1946, the question of what to do about Siegel had moved beyond Lansky's unilateral authority. Bugsy Siegel was shot on the evening of June 20, 1947, while sitting in the living room of Virginia Hill's house in Beverly Hills. A rifle fired through the window struck him 4 times. He was dead before anyone in the house reached him. The timing of what happened next has passed into the lore of Las Vegas in a way that nothing else from the mob era has quite matched. Within approximately 20 minutes of the shooting, Lansky's associates, Gus Greenbaum and Mo Sedway, walked into the Flamingo and assumed operational control. The precision of the timing made one thing clear. Whatever had been arranged was arranged completely before the trigger was pulled, and the person who arranged things completely in Lansky's organization was Lansky. The Flamingo, under competent management, became exactly what Siegel had imagined it could be. The hotel turned profitable within months, and the model it demonstrated attracted syndicate investment in subsequent Las Vegas properties across the following decade. Lansky held interests, usually hidden behind his brother Jake or other frontmen, in the Thunderbird, the Sands, and later the Tropicana and Caesars Palace. The mechanism through which the money actually left the casinos and reached the syndicate was the skim, cash removed from the count room before it was officially recorded, moved out of the state by couriers, and distributed to the participating families through channels designed to leave no documentable trail. Lansky managed the flow. Bagmen moved cash to Chicago, Minneapolis, and New York. The money that arrived at his end was clean enough, in practical terms, to disappear into the offshore architecture he had been building since the early 1930s. The full scale of what this system generated is impossible to audit precisely because auditing it was the thing Lansky spent his entire career preventing. The FBI's estimate of his personal holdings, at $300 million by 1970, was based on inference and informant testimony rather than documentation, because the documentation simply did not exist in the form that would have made a prosecution viable. The money was there, or had been there, but the path from the casino floor to the Swiss account had been constructed with enough layers that no single piece of evidence connected the beginning to the end. This was the innovation that distinguished Lansky from every other figure of his era. The bootleggers, and the killers, and the bosses who ran the families all generated money. Lansky was the person who figured out how to keep it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, while the casinos were running and the Swiss accounts were filling, a different kind of operation was underway. The US government needed Meyer Lansky, and he made sure the price was right. Section 4. The Government's Gangster. On the evening of February 9, 1942, the converted French ocean liner SS Normandie caught fire at Pier 88 in Manhattan and capsized into the Hudson River. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, with German U-boats actively hunting Allied shipping along the eastern seaboard, the Office of Naval Intelligence was not prepared to accept that a welding torch and a pile of burlap-wrapped life preservers had simply gotten out of hand. The official investigation eventually concluded that the fire was accidental. By then, the damage was irrelevant, because what mattered was not what had actually happened, but what the Navy believed might happen next. New York Harbor was the principal logistical artery of the Allied war effort in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies and troops moved through its piers each month, and the men who worked those piers were Union members, whose cooperation, or non-cooperation, could determine whether any of it moved at all. The Office of Naval Intelligence understood something important about those piers. The government did not control them. The mob did. The question was whether the mob's control could be redirected. Commander Charles Haffenden of the 3rd Naval District was the officer who decided to find out. His path to the answer ran through the Manhattan District Attorney's office and then, through a series of conversations, to a man named Joseph Lanza, who ran the Fulton Fish Market on behalf of the syndicate. Lanza was cooperative, but honest about his own limits. He controlled the fish market. He did not control the waterfront. For the waterfront, there was only one name that mattered, and that man was sitting in a prison cell at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, 225 miles north of Manhattan, serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for compulsory prostitution. Lucky Luciano had been put there in 1936 by a special prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. By 1942, he was the only person in the country who could deliver what the Navy needed. Lansky made the trip to Dannemora. He brought Lanza and Luciano's attorney, Moses Polikoff. When they arrived at Great Meadow Correctional Facility, where Luciano had been transferred in May 1942 to accommodate the visits, Luciano was reportedly surprised to see them there at all. Once they explained the situation, he agreed without hesitation, and the reasons were not entirely patriotic. Cooperation with the government gave Luciano a mechanism to reassert authority over his crime family from inside a prison cell, to demonstrate to his subordinates that his reach was still operational, and to build a record of wartime service that might eventually support a case for early release. All of those calculations proved correct. What followed was organized, in the way that everything Lansky organized was organized, methodically, with attention to who needed to be contacted at which level of the waterfront infrastructure to achieve the specific result. Longshoremen's union officials fell into line when Luciano's name was used. Albert Anastasia, who controlled the Brooklyn docks with a combination of labor relationships and violence that had made him one of the most feared men in the city, guaranteed cooperation from the stevedores. The entire New York waterfront, which had been a source of anxiety to naval intelligence, became an extension of the syndicate's information-gathering operation. Dock workers who had previously answered to no federal authority suddenly had an incentive to report suspicious behavior, because the alternative was answering to Anastasia. Dock strikes, which had been a continuous concern, stopped. No major act of sabotage occurred in the port of New York for the duration of the war. Lansky's specific role, as described by people who were present and by testimony gathered in subsequent state investigations, was to serve as Luciano's operational contact on the outside, translating Luciano's directives into action and keeping the relationship between the mob and naval intelligence running smoothly enough that neither side felt exposed. One naval intelligence officer later described the condition of the waterfront after the arrangement was in place as one of open and cooperative intelligence sharing, achieved through people who were, in his carefully chosen formulation, very influential on the various docks. That influence was Lansky's network. The Sicily intelligence operation that followed in 1943 was a direct extension of the same arrangement. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily launched in July 1943, required detailed local knowledge of terrain, coastlines, harbor layouts, and the attitudes of the local population that standard intelligence channels could not provide. Haffenden went back to Luciano, and Luciano went back to Lansky. Through Luciano's contacts among Sicilian immigrants in New York, many of whom maintained family and criminal connections to the island, naval intelligence gathered maps, coastal photographs, and corrections to existing charts. Some of those contacts also carried Luciano's personal authority to Sicilian crime figures, signaling that cooperation with the Allied landing was expected. The extent to which Sicilian Mafia assistance shaped the actual outcome of the invasion remains a matter of historical debate, but Haffenden's own correspondence, later surfaced in a New York State investigation, described Luciano's assistance as important to the development of intelligence for the operation. In January 1946, Luciano was paroled. In February, he was deported to Italy. The wartime service record had done what it was supposed to do. This episode sits somewhat uneasily in most accounts of Lansky's life, because it does not fit cleanly into any simple narrative. The films and the popular versions of the mob era prefer their criminals to be criminals, and their governments to be governments, operating in separate spheres that occasionally collide. What Operation Underworld documented was something more complicated, that the distinction between those spheres, in the specific context of New York Harbor in 1942, was not a distinction the government was willing to insist on when its own interests required otherwise. Lansky had understood this about governments for most of his adult life. They could be worked with, if approached correctly. The anti-Nazi campaign of the late 1930s had demonstrated the same principle from a different angle. The German-American Bund was a legal organization under the First Amendment, which meant that the Jewish community leaders who found its rallies intolerable had no legal mechanism for shutting them down. The Bund held mass events in Manhattan and its surrounding neighborhoods, marching in brown-shirted uniforms under swastika banners, distributing literature, and drawing audiences that in some cases numbered in the thousands. At a rally in Madison Square Garden in February 1939, more than 20,000 people gathered under banners that called for what the Bund described as a white, gentile-ruled America. The organization's leader, Fritz Kuhn, modeled himself explicitly on Hitler and spoke openly about the same goals. Judge Nathan Perlman, a former Republican congressman from New York, decided that the legal avenue was a dead end and picked up a telephone. His call went to Meyer Lansky. The two men met, and Perlman was direct. He wanted the Bund rallies disrupted through physical violence, with one condition: nobody was to be killed. Lansky asked for nothing in return, which Perlman found surprising enough to mention in subsequent accounts of the meeting. Lansky's explanation, as he recalled it years later, was simple. The Jews in Europe were his brothers, and what he could do in Manhattan, he would do. The campaign that followed was not improvised. Lansky had his men trained by boxers specifically for the work. because a rally disruption required different skills than the controlled violence of organized crime enforcement. The first major operation targeted a Bund march at the Yorkville Casino in April 1938. Yorkville, on Manhattan's Upper East Side, had the heaviest concentration of Germans in the city, and East 86th Street had earned a nickname among locals that reflected the neighborhood's political atmosphere. Lansky's crew arrived at the rally, outnumbered by the Bund membership, but prepared in a way the Bund members were not. The operation lasted long enough to leave a substantial number of Bund attendees with broken bones and produced no fatalities, which was the only constraint Perlman had imposed. Afterward, Lansky's men left their weapons and the American Legion hats they had worn as a cover story and disappeared into the street. The disruptions continued for months. Perlman coordinated similar campaigns in other cities, reaching out to Jewish gangsters in Newark, Minneapolis, Chicago, and Los Angeles. But the New York operation was the largest and the one Lansky ran personally. A historian who later documented the period noted that the pattern of outcomes at Bund events was consistent across the months of the campaign. Nazi arms, legs, and ribs were broken, and skulls were cracked, but no one died. The Bund did not disappear, but its presence in New York became considerably less comfortable. The third chapter of Lansky's wartime and immediate post-war service was the one he valued most personally, and the one that would produce the sharpest irony of his later life. After the Second World War ended, and the full scale of what had happened in Europe became undeniable, the push for a sovereign Jewish state reached the stage of armed conflict. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War put the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary force defending settlements in Palestine, in a position of severe military disadvantage. The Arab armies were better equipped and better supplied. The American government had imposed an arms embargo on the region that applied formally to all parties, but in practice prevented the Haganah from accessing the surplus military equipment that was sitting in warehouses across the United States at the end of the war. The Haganah's chief arms purchaser in the United States, Yehuda Arazi, understood that nothing moved through the port of New York without the cooperation of the longshoremen, and that the longshoremen moved to the instructions of the men who controlled the docks. He approached Lansky directly. The request was straightforward: help get weapons onto ships bound for Israel, and help prevent weapons from reaching the Arab armies. Lansky said he would handle it. What happened next on the New York docks was documented in the specific and unhurried language of mechanical failure. A consignment of arms from a Pittsburgh dealer, bound for the Arab side, fell overboard during loading. Another weapons cargo was loaded by mistake onto ships bound for Haifa, rather than the ports they were originally destined for. Crates of military hardware, some still packed in the preserving oil and straw of wartime storage, made their way onto vessels that happened to be sailing for Israel. None of these events were investigated with particular urgency. Lansky had reached Albert Anastasia and Joe Adonis, the men whose relationships with the International Longshoremen's Association gave them effective control over what moved and in what direction, and the docks had responded accordingly. The full scale of Lansky's financial support for Israel during this period extended well beyond the weapons operation. Reports from the period and subsequent accounts describe him raising significant sums to purchase the ships used to transport Holocaust survivors from European displaced persons camps to Palestine before the state was formally established, and transferring substantial amounts to support the military training and equipment needs of the Haganah. The precise figures remain difficult to establish, partly because Lansky was simultaneously hiding money from the American government and sending some of it abroad for purposes he regarded as more important than his own financial security. The irony, which arrived in full force in 1972, was that Israel refused to let him stay. When Lansky arrived in Tel Aviv in July 1970 to claim citizenship under the law of return, the Israeli government confronted a dilemma that the prime minister at the time, Golda Meir, reportedly found deeply uncomfortable. The law of return gave every Jew the right to settle in Israel. A separate provision allowed the government to deny that right to applicants with criminal backgrounds who posed a danger to public welfare. Lansky was precisely the test case nobody had designed the law to handle. He was a Jew who had spent his own money and used his own criminal network to help the state exist. He was also one of the most consequential organized crime figures in American history. The Interior Ministry denied his application. The Israeli Supreme Court upheld the decision. Lansky walked his small dog, a Shih Tzu named Bruiser he had brought from Miami Beach, through the neighborhoods of Tel Aviv for 2.5 years, while lawyers argued and courts deliberated, and ordinary Israelis who encountered him on the street often had no idea who he was. When the legal avenues were exhausted, he was given a document that would allow him to travel to any country willing to receive him, and sent out. He flew back to the United States and was arrested at Miami International Airport. The man who had helped secure the docks for the U.S. Navy, broken Bund rallies for the Jewish community, and smuggled weapons to the Haganah, was arrested in his home country and told that Israel had no use for him. 3 separate governments, in 3 separate contexts, had taken exactly what they needed from Meyer Lansky and then declined to acknowledge that the transaction had occurred. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, Lansky fought Nazis, ran wartime intelligence, and armed Israel's founding war. None of it earned him a single official concession. Cuba was next, and he built something there that made all of it look small. Section 5. The Caribbean Kingdom. Fulgencio Batista raised a toast to his cabinet on the evening of December 31, 1958, wished them well, and then loaded what he could carry onto 3 cargo planes and flew to the Dominican Republic. By the time the sun came up on January 1, 1959, the man who had run Cuba as a joint venture with the American underworld for most of 2 decades was gone, and everything Meyer Lansky had built on the island was already beginning to collapse. The Cuba operation had started more than 25 years earlier, born from the same calculation that had driven every major move of Lansky's career. Prohibition ended in December 1933, and within weeks, Lansky was already looking south. Cuba was 90 miles from Florida, close enough to the American tourist market to be accessible, and far enough from American law enforcement to be ungoverned. Fulgencio Batista had just seized control of the island in a military coup that same year, announcing himself as the kind of authoritarian whose cooperation could be purchased at a predictable price. Lansky introduced himself to Batista and proposed a straightforward arrangement. The mob would pay regular money to Batista and his inner circle, and in return would be permitted to operate casinos and clubs without interference from Cuban authorities. Batista understood the terms and accepted them. The relationship deepened gradually. By 1939, Cuba's gambling industry had developed a reputation problem serious enough to threaten the tourist revenues both Batista and Lansky depended on. An American financial advisor connected to Senator Richard Nixon had publicly complained about being cheated at a Havana casino, which produced a diplomatic inquiry and an unflattering investigation by the U.S. Embassy. Batista's response was to appoint Meyer Lansky, one of America's most wanted organized crime figures, as his official advisor on gambling reform. The logic was not as absurd as it sounds. Lansky had spent 2 decades insisting on honest games in his own operations because he understood that the mathematics of a properly run casino already guaranteed profit, and that a reputation for honest dealing was the only sustainable competitive advantage in the gambling business. Bringing him in to professionalize Havana's operations was, from a purely commercial standpoint, a rational decision. The formal framework for the large-scale expansion came in 1955, when Batista enacted Hotel Law 2074. The law offered casino licenses, 10-year tax exemptions, duty-free importation of equipment, and matching government investment for any hotel built at a cost of more than $1 million. It was, in practical terms, an invitation written specifically for the syndicate. Here is government money, here is immunity from local law, here are the licenses, build whatever you want. The conditions that Lansky and Batista had been working toward informally since 1933 were now written into Cuban statute. All that was required was investment. Before the formal expansion, however, came the gathering that set the agenda for everything that followed. On the evening of December 22, 1946, more than 20 American crime bosses converged on the Hotel Nacional de Cuba in Havana. The Hotel Nacional was the most prestigious address on the island, a grand Spanish colonial building on a bluff above the Malecon, with a view of the harbor, and Lansky had reserved its rooms and a meeting space for the week. The conference, which has passed into organized crime history as the Havana Conference, was the most significant gathering of American criminal leadership since the Atlantic City Summit of 1929. Lucky Luciano was present, which required careful logistics. Luciano had been deported to Italy in February 1946, following his wartime cooperation deal with the Navy, and American authorities had not expected to encounter him again in the Western Hemisphere. In late October, he had traveled from Italy to Caracas, then to Mexico City, then to Havana, arriving with a passport issued in his birth name, Salvatore Lucania. Lansky met him at the airport. In the months before the conference, Lansky had suggested that Luciano purchase a stake in the Hotel Nacional Casino, which was controlled jointly by Lansky and Batista as silent partner. Luciano had agreed, funding the investment with the cash envelopes that the assembled bosses brought as gifts to welcome him back. The total that came in from those envelopes reportedly exceeded $200,000. The conference ran through Christmas and into the following days. The assembled leadership discussed the drug trade, the Las Vegas situation, and the question of what to do about the Flamingo Hotel's mounting problems. Bugsy Siegel's future was the most consequential item on the agenda, and Lansky, according to a fellow attendee named Doc Stacher, who was present and later discussed the meeting, argued for Siegel to be given more time. The argument bought Siegel a temporary reprieve. It did not save his life. Siegel was shot in Beverly Hills 6 months after the Havana conference ended, and the Flamingo immediately transferred to Lansky's associates. With Luciano's presence in Cuba eventually discovered by American authorities, who then pressured the Cuban government to deport him, Lansky became the dominant figure in Havana's criminal landscape without any rival for the role. His brother Jake managed the Hotel Nacional Casino on a day-to-day basis. By 1957, according to accounts from that period, the Nacional's casino was generating revenues comparable to the largest operations on the Las Vegas Strip, which said something specific about both the scale of the Cuba enterprise and about how completely Lansky had transformed an island 90 miles from Florida into a major gambling destination. Joseph Stacker, a Lansky associate from their shared roots in the Jewish neighborhoods of their youth, served as the operation's official bribe paymaster. Stacker managed the corrupt payments to Batista's government with the same systematic discipline that characterized everything Lansky ran. Regular amounts, reliable delivery, nothing improvised. The arrangement that Batista had ultimately settled on was a guarantee of somewhere between $3 and $5 million annually in exchange for a monopoly on casino gambling, plus a percentage of profits on top of the base payment. From Batista's perspective, Meyer Lansky had become the most valuable economic partner the Cuban government had. From Lansky's perspective, Batista had become the most valuable political asset the syndicate possessed anywhere in the world. The crown of the entire Cuba operation was the Hotel Habana Riviera, and it was built on the Malecon waterfront boulevard, in Havana's Vedado district, in the manner of a man who believed the arrangement he had made was permanent. Construction began in December 1956. The hotel that rose over the following year was 21 stories tall, containing 352 rooms, all with views of the water. It was designed by a Miami Beach architect named Igor Polovitsky, who imported the aesthetics of South Florida modernism and amplified them into something that was meant to signal Havana's equivalence with any luxury destination in the world. The Riviera was the first building in Cuba with complete central air conditioning, a detail that mattered in a Caribbean climate in ways that were immediately obvious to every guest. Lansky's actual ownership was hidden behind the customary layers of frontmen and shell arrangements, because Nevada gaming regulations of the period prevented anyone with interests in an offshore casino from simultaneously holding a Nevada license. His name did not appear on the documents. The hotel opened on December 10, 1957. Ginger Rogers performed at the opening, with a floor show that was carried in part on American network television. The audience in the Copa Cabaret that evening included American press, Hollywood celebrities, and the kind of wealthy tourists who represented the market Lansky had always been building toward. Within 4 months of opening, the Riviera had recouped its investors' costs. By its first full year of operation, it had generated approximately $3 million in casino revenue. It was the largest casino hotel in the world outside of Las Vegas, and it was sitting on a foundation that required a specific Cuban political arrangement to remain viable. The arrangement required Batista, and Batista, by late 1958, was running out of time in ways that the mob's leadership in Havana had consistently underestimated. Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement had been growing since November 1956, when Castro and 80 men had landed from a yacht called the Granma on Cuba's southeastern coast and been immediately attacked by Batista's army. Only a handful survived to reach the safety of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From that position, over the following 2 years, Castro built a guerrilla force that Batista's increasingly demoralized military proved unable to dislodge. By the fall of 1958, it was clear to anyone watching the military situation honestly that Batista's position was deteriorating. The mob's leadership in Havana watched this with the same mixture of denial and selective optimism that had characterized the syndicate's political risk assessment throughout the Cuba years. Santo Traficante Jr., who ran his own casino operations on the island, believed that whoever succeeded Batista would maintain the gambling arrangement because the revenues were too large to abandon. Lansky understood the situation more clearly, but had spent too much and built too much to act on what he understood. On the night of December 31st, 1958, while Batista was loading cargo planes, Lansky gave a specific instruction to his partners in Havana: close the casinos immediately and take all the cash. It was a characteristically precise response to an irreversible situation. Some of his partners followed the instruction and some did not, and the variation in outcomes between those who did and those who did not was significant. When Castro's supporters took to the streets of Havana on the morning of January 1, they ransacked a number of the hotel casinos directly. Slot machines were carried into the streets and smashed or burned. The symbols of what Batista's Cuba had been were being destroyed in public by people who had lived under the arrangement for more than 20 years and had their own views about what it had cost them. Castro himself did not arrive in Havana until January 8th. Lansky had already left the day before. The man who had built his Cuban empire on the proposition that a corrupt government in a nearby country could be maintained indefinitely through well-managed bribery was on a plane back to Florida while the hotels he owned were being taken over by a revolutionary government that had no interest in any arrangement he might propose. The nationalization of the hotel casinos was formalized in October 1960. Castro had announced his intentions plainly. The foreign gambling operations were finished. Che Guevara had been appointed to oversee public safety, and the new government's position on organized crime's presence in Cuba was uncomplicated in a way that Batista's position had never been. The Riviera, the Hotel Nacional, the Montmartre Club, and every other property in which Lansky held an interest were absorbed into the Cuban state. His losses from Cuba were estimated at somewhere between $7 million and $10 million, depending on which accounting was used. His response, as he described his Cuba experience in later years to people who asked, was a single flat sentence: he had crapped out. The loss was larger than the dollar figure suggested. Cuba had been the model for what Lansky believed organized crime's future looked like. A foreign jurisdiction with a cooperative government, large-scale legitimate hotel and casino infrastructure, and revenues flowing through a financial architecture that kept the connection between criminal organization and legitimate business sufficiently obscured to be unassailable. Las Vegas had the same basic structure, but with American law enforcement and American regulatory bodies as permanent variables. Cuba had eliminated those variables entirely. It had been, in the cleanest version of Lansky's vision, exactly the arrangement he had spent his career working toward. When it ended in a single night, he lost not just the money but the proof of concept. The gambling empire moved on to the Bahamas and to London, where Lansky's connections produced casino licenses in the 1960s. Neither was Cuba. Neither operated at the scale or with the impunity that Havana had offered in its decade of peak operation. What Cuba had demonstrated, in its collapse as much as in its success, was the single structural vulnerability in everything Lansky built. All of it required a government willing to look the other way, and governments, unlike the mathematics of blackjack, were not reliable over time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, Cuba was gone in a single night. The government had been watching long before Castro moved, and what followed was the longest, most expensive failed prosecution in the history of American organized crime. Section 6. The man they could not catch. Senator Estes Kefauver opened his committee's New York hearings in March 1951, and somewhere in the region of 30 million Americans watched the broadcasts. The figure was cited as the largest television audience in the medium's brief history at that point, which said something about how completely the public had been waiting for someone to pull back the curtain. What they saw, over several days of live testimony, was a parade of men who knew exactly how to sit in a Senate hearing room without giving anything away. Frank Costello became the defining image of the proceedings, not because of what he said, but because he refused to let the cameras show his face. And the networks filled hours of broadcast time with footage of his hands resting on the table, while his voice answered questions with the precise degree of vagueness that stopped just short of contempt. Virginia Hill, Bugsy Siegel's former girlfriend, was colorful enough in her evasions that she punched a female journalist on her way out of the chamber. The witnesses who appeared before the Kefauver Committee that spring had a collective understanding of what the Constitution's Fifth Amendment was for, and used it with practiced efficiency. Meyer Lansky appeared before the committee during its New York sessions and gave testimony concerning Saratoga Springs gambling operations and the 1946 Havana Conference, where the assembled crime leadership had welcomed Luciano back from Italy. He gave the committee enough to confirm what they already knew, and nothing that could be developed into a charge. This was a pattern that federal investigators would encounter with Lansky for the next 2 decades, and understanding why it persisted requires understanding what the government was working with. The Kefauver Committee confirmed, publicly and on national television, that an organized national crime syndicate existed and that it was corrupting local governments throughout the country. What it could not do was generate prosecutions from its findings, because the witnesses it questioned understood their legal rights, and the evidence the committee had assembled was testimonial and circumstantial rather than documentary. The hearings produced enormous public pressure on law enforcement to act, but the targets of that pressure had spent years specifically designing their operations to be impossible to document. Lansky had been doing this since the early 1930s. The deeper institutional failure exposed by the Kefauver hearings was not the committee's inability to prosecute. It was the FBI's 20-year refusal to acknowledge that the problem existed at all. J. Edgar Hoover had maintained, through the entire period from Prohibition to 1950, that there was no national crime syndicate and that the FBI's resources were better directed at communist subversion than at organized crime. The reasons for this position have been debated ever since, ranging from Hoover's genuine institutional priorities to speculation about compromising relationships between Hoover and various crime figures. What is documented is that the FBI's posture left local and state law enforcement without the federal resources and coordination that prosecuting a national organization required, and that Hoover's denial of the syndicate's existence had allowed men like Lansky to operate for 2 decades without significant federal attention. The Kefauver hearings embarrassed Hoover sufficiently that he launched what the Bureau called its Top Hoodlum program, directing field offices to identify and build files on the most significant organized crime figures in their regions. It was a belated acknowledgement that the hearings had made his previous position untenable. The program produced surveillance rather than prosecution. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the FBI deployed wiretaps and listening devices against a widening circle of organized crime figures, building intelligence files that documented conversations, relationships, and operations in remarkable detail. By 1960, the Bureau had ramped up its specific efforts against Lansky, installing bugs in his Hallandale, Florida home, and running informants who met with him wearing concealed recording equipment. The transcripts that resulted were thorough enough to map his private life and his expressed opinions on everything from the Kennedy administration to the state of his health. They were not, in the legal sense that would have allowed prosecution, evidence of specific crimes to which he was provably connected. Lansky was aware that he was being watched. He had always been aware of it, and the awareness was built into how he operated. He did not discuss criminal transactions in terms that would be useful to a federal prosecutor. He discussed problems in the abstract, referenced arrangements without specifics, and met the people who mattered to his business, in person rather than on telephones or in rooms where anyone might be listening. The 1957 Appalachian meeting changed the public dimension of the problem without changing Lansky's position within it. In November of that year, New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell had followed a suspicious number of luxury cars to a rural estate in Appalachian, a small town in upstate New York, and stumbled into what amounted to a full national convention of the American underworld. Dozens of organized crime leaders from across the country fled through fields and woods, trying to evade the roadblocks Croswell improvised as quickly as he could. 63 men were identified. The meeting's purpose was never formally established in court, though the consensus among investigators was that it had been called to address the aftermath of Albert Anastasia's murder a month earlier and the resulting power shifts within the New York families. What it demonstrated beyond any remaining doubt was that the commission Lansky and Luciano had helped build in the 1930s was still operational, still meeting, and still governing organized crime at a national level. Hoover's position that no such organization existed was no longer defensible. Lansky had not been at Appalachian. His business did not require his physical presence at gatherings that might be raided. Robert Kennedy's involvement with organized crime investigations began in earnest during the late 1950s, when he served as chief counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field, the McClellan Committee, named for its chairman John McClellan of Arkansas. Kennedy pursued Jimmy Hoffa of the Teamsters and various crime figures with an intensity that was personal as well as institutional, and when he became Attorney General in January 1961, under his brother's administration, the resources of the Justice Department shifted to match that intensity. The organized crime and racketeering section grew. IRS agents were coordinated with FBI investigators. For the first time, the federal government was genuinely trying to build cases against the figures the Kefauver Committee had identified a decade earlier. Lansky was among them. The instrument that Robert Kennedy hoped would break organized crime's wall of silence was a soldier named Joseph Valachi, who in 1963 became the first initiated member of the American Mafia to testify publicly about the organization's structure, rituals, and operations. Valachi had been in prison on narcotics charges when he became convinced that Vito Genovese had ordered him killed. He fatally stabbed a fellow inmate he believed had been sent to kill him, which produced a life sentence and a calculation that cooperation was now his only viable option. His testimony before the McClellan Committee in September and October of 1963 produced 30 hours of television and a nation's worth of front-page coverage. He named the 5 families. He described initiation ceremonies. He confirmed what investigators had been documenting for years about the structure of the commission. He also confirmed, in testimony that the FBI paraphrased in a 1968 memo, that Vito Genovese and Meyer Lansky had common holdings in Las Vegas and Havana, and that wherever Lansky operated, Genovese had an interest. It was a significant claim, because it positioned Lansky not just as an independent operator, but as the financial arm of one of the most powerful Italian families in the country. The practical implication was that Lansky's autonomy was more circumscribed than his legend suggested. He was not above the structure. He was embedded in it, managing money for people who held ultimate authority over the operations that generated it. What Valachi's testimony could not do was provide the specific, documentable, legally actionable evidence that would allow a prosecutor to charge Lansky with anything. Valachi was a foot soldier. He knew the general architecture of the organization and a substantial number of its murders and internal politics. He did not know the financial arrangements that Lansky had constructed, because those arrangements were known only to the people who needed to know them, and Lansky had spent 40 years ensuring that circle was as small as possible. The FBI files that accumulated through the 1960s were extensive, detailed, and ultimately insufficient. Agents documented Lansky's daily routines, his medical appointments, his conversations with his wife, his opinions about the people around him. They could not document the flow of money in a way that connected him to specific illegal income. The bugged conversations from Lansky's Hallandale home illustrated the problem with precision. FBI agents listening to those recordings heard a man who was careful, who expressed himself in ways that were consistent with legitimate business concerns, and who understood that anything he said in his own house might eventually be heard by people he did not want listening. The recordings caught his bitterness about Robert Kennedy's pursuit of the mob, captured in private remarks to his wife that the agents noted in their files. They caught his anxiety about the Israel situation when it developed in 1970. They did not catch him directing murders, authorizing crimes, or moving money in ways that could be traced through the legal system to a specific chargeable offense. The architecture he had built around himself was specifically designed to produce this outcome. In 1970, the government's most serious attempt to bring Lansky down finally materialized in the form of a federal tax evasion indictment, connected to the Flamingo Hotel skimming operation. The allegation, developed by prosecutors who had been building the case for years, was that Lansky and others had conspired to skim $36 million from the Flamingo between 1960 and 1968, and that this income had not been reported to the IRS. The scale of the alleged operation was significant. $36 million extracted systematically from a single casino over 8 years, routed through a network of couriers and accounts that the prosecution had been attempting to map through informant testimony and financial analysis. It was the most concentrated effort the federal government had made against Lansky since Al Capone's tax prosecution had served as the conceptual template for everything that came after. Lansky learned about the indictment before it was filed. He was in Florida in July 1970 when he and his second wife Thelma boarded a flight to Tel Aviv, carrying their small dog and whatever personal effects they could bring on a trip they intended to make permanent. He spent the next 2.5 years in Israel, walking his dog through the streets of Tel Aviv while courts debated whether he could stay. When the Israeli Supreme Court upheld the Interior Ministry's decision to expel him in 1972, he flew back to the United States and was arrested at Miami International Airport, exactly as federal authorities had expected. The tax evasion trial that followed in 1973 ended with acquittal. The jury returned a not guilty verdict on the income tax evasion charges and the additional indictments that had been filed around the same period, including the charge in 1972 that he had participated in the Flamingo Scheme, were dismissed because he was deemed too ill to face trial. By December 1974, the remaining charges had been abandoned entirely. His health had deteriorated, to the point where the government's own medical assessments suggested that pursuing a prosecution would be unconscionable. He had suffered a heart attack years earlier, and lung cancer would eventually kill him in January 1983. The FBI stopped its active surveillance of Lansky in 1971, the assessment being that the Cuba losses had diminished his operational significance to the point where the resources required to maintain the watching were no longer justified by the returns. It was, in retrospect, one of the more revealing judgments any federal agency made about him. The man who had been described for 2 decades as one of the most dangerous figures in American organized crime was deemed, in his late 60s, with failing health and a depleted financial position, no longer worth watching. The $300 million the Bureau had estimated as his personal fortune in 1970 had never been found. The prosecutions had failed or been abandoned. The surveillance had produced thousands of pages of documentation and 0 convictions on anything beyond a gambling charge in 1953. What persisted, in the absence of successful prosecution, was the government's conviction that the money existed somewhere in the system Lansky had built, hidden in accounts and structures that nobody had yet mapped completely. That conviction was never resolved during his lifetime, because the documentation that would have resolved it was precisely what Lansky had spent 50 years making certain did not exist. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, the government spent 20 years trying to catch him, and walked away with a 2-month gambling conviction. Behind all of it was a private life almost nobody knew, a disabled son, 2 marriages, and the emotional logic that drove everything. Section 7. The Little Man at Home. Bernard Lansky was born on January 15, 1930, in Brooklyn, with cerebral palsy. The condition was severe enough that it would define the entirety of his life, shaping his father's emotional interior in ways that nothing else in Meyer Lansky's 70-year criminal career came close to replicating. Buddy, as everyone called him, grew up watching his father build one of the largest criminal financial structures in American history while being physically unable to participate in most of what ordinary life required. Cerebral palsy, in its more serious forms, affects motor control, balance, and the coordination of movement in ways that worsen over time without curative intervention. And in 1930, in Brooklyn, with the medical resources available to a working-class Jewish immigrant family, the diagnosis carried essentially no treatment pathway. Lansky was 27 years old when Buddy was born, still in the early stages of what would become a 50-year criminal career, and not yet wealthy enough to provide anything beyond what his immediate earnings could cover. The child he would spend the rest of his life worrying about arrived before the empire was built, which meant that the empire, in part, was built with Buddy in mind. This is not a romantic interpretation of Lansky's motives. He was building criminal operations for the same reasons criminal operations are always built, because they generated money that legitimate work could not, because the skills he had developed from childhood made him exceptionally suited to the work, and because the network of relationships he had built with Luciano, Siegel, and the emerging syndicate made the criminal world the only realistic professional environment available to him by the time he was old enough to choose. But the emotional weight of Buddy's disability sat underneath everything. When Lansky described, in various contexts throughout his life, why he had made the choices he made, the answer he returned to most consistently was that he had seen two roads when he was young, and had taken the wrong one. Whether that regret was genuine or performed is something only he could have known. What is documentable is what happened to Buddy, and what it reveals about what 50 years of criminal wealth actually purchased. The first marriage, to Anna Citron, had been contracted in 1929, in the brief window between the Atlantic City Conference that laid the groundwork for the National Crime Syndicate and the murders of Masseria and Maranzano that created it. Lansky had known Anna through the Lower East Side social circles where Jewish families of similar immigrant backgrounds found each other, and the marriage was never described by anyone close to the family as a love match of any particular heat. Anna struggled with mental illness throughout the years of their marriage, a detail that Sandra Lansky's memoir returns to as one of the defining tragedies of her childhood. Lansky was absent frequently, which was partly a function of his work, and partly a function of how little comfort the home offered. The marriage lasted 18 years, formally ending in divorce in 1947, the same year that Bugsy Siegel was shot in Beverly Hills, and the Flamingo passed into the direct control of Lansky's associates. 3 children came from that marriage. Buddy was the eldest, born in 1930. Paul came 2 years later, in 1932. Sandra arrived in 1937, the only daughter, born into a household where her father was simultaneously managing the Saratoga Springs casino operations, building the Florida gambling empire, and beginning the negotiations with Batista's Cuba that would occupy the next 2 decades. Sandra has described growing up with little direct knowledge of what her father did, which is consistent with how Lansky managed information inside his own household. He showed her, at some point during her childhood, a showroom full of Wurlitzer jukeboxes at a company called MB Distributing near Times Square, and she concluded that her father was in the jukebox business. The men who came to dinner and were introduced as uncles included Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Siegel, though she knew Siegel only as a friendly adult in her parents' social circle. The life around her was wealthy, protected, and structured to shield her from the nature of the work that produced it. What she could not be shielded from was her mother's deteriorating mental health and Buddy's condition. These two realities ran through the household as permanent, irresolvable presences, and Sandra's later account of growing up in the Lansky family circles backed to both of them repeatedly as the elements that could not be managed or concealed the way her father managed everything else. Lansky had built a system for making criminal money invisible. He had no system for what Buddy's cerebral palsy meant to the family's daily life, or for what Anna's mental illness meant to her children. Lansky's response to Buddy was financial and relentless. The support never stopped. Throughout Buddy's adult years, when the condition had progressed to the point where sustained employment was impossible, when a brief stint as a switchboard operator proved unworkable, when the ordinary markers of independent adult life receded as complete impossibilities, Lansky continued providing whatever Buddy needed to survive with some level of comfort. This was not unusual for a father, but it carried a particular weight in Lansky's case because the money being used was the money the government had spent decades trying to trace, the money that $300 million estimate was meant to describe. Some portion of whatever Lansky actually accumulated over 50 years in organized crime was funneled into keeping his disabled son alive and reasonably cared for. His second marriage, to Thelma Schwartz, began in 1948, the year after the divorce from Anna was finalized. Thelma, who everyone called Teddy, was different from Anna in almost every register. She was stable, pragmatic, and genuinely devoted to Lansky in a way that sustained the relationship through 2.5 years of Israeli exile, multiple federal indictments, heart surgery in 1973, and the lung cancer that eventually killed him. She had met him in 1947 while on vacation in Miami, and by multiple accounts of people who knew them together, the marriage was the emotional center of his later life, in a way that the first marriage had never been. His step-granddaughter Cynthia Duncan, who grew up visiting the couple regularly in their Miami Beach apartment, described an affectionate domestic relationship, a man who enjoyed talking about history, mathematics, and philosophy, who read Emerson and Spinoza, who had maintained a Book of the Month Club membership through years of managing offshore banks and skimming Las Vegas casinos, and who in restaurants would receive visitors at the dinner table with the quiet gravity of someone people genuinely feared and genuinely respected in approximately equal measure. Teddy also provided something more concrete than companionship. During the 1973 tax evasion trial, one of the government's key witnesses was a large criminal informant named Vincent Teresa, who had provided testimony that Lansky had received a cash payment in Miami, his share of proceeds from a London casino operation, on a specific date. The payment, if proven, would have supported the tax evasion charge. Teddy Lansky took the stand and testified that her husband had been with her in a Boston hotel on that date, recovering from a hernia operation and caring for a sick dog. The alibi held. The jury acquitted him. Without Thelma Lansky's testimony, the outcome of the most serious federal prosecution of his career might have been different. The most structurally revealing thing about Meyer Lansky's private life, though, is not the second marriage's stability, or even Buddy's condition in isolation. It is the contrast his children present as a group. Lansky insisted consistently, by every account from people who knew him, that his children should pursue legitimate lives. He said this in various formulations throughout his life, often in the context of the road he had taken when he was young, and the road he had not. With Paul, he achieved the most striking possible version of this ambition. Paul Lansky was appointed to the United States Military Academy at West Point through the congressional appointment process, and the member of Congress who arranged the appointment was Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, the same man who had run the televised Senate investigations that put organized crime's existence on national television and called Lansky himself to testify. Whether Kefauver was aware of the connection when he made the appointment is not established in the record. The senator's subsequent letter about the matter noted only that the Lansky boy had justified the confidence placed in him. Paul graduated from West Point in 1954 and joined the Air Force as an officer, eventually serving in Vietnam and resigning his commission as a captain in 1963 to take a civilian engineering position in Tacoma, Washington. He maintained a studied public distance from his father's world, going far enough in that direction that he suggested to people who asked that he and the elder Lansky had experienced some kind of falling out and were not in contact. The falling out was not real. It was professional camouflage, the kind of careful management of appearances that Lansky had practiced his whole life and apparently passed on at least in part to his son. Paul named his own son Meyer Lansky II, which the elder Lansky initially refused, then accepted, and was ultimately proud of, according to the grandson's own later account. Sandra's memoir, published in 2014, presented a father of unexpected tenderness, protective and emotionally present in ways that the public record of his criminal career could not have suggested. She described being introduced to Frank Sinatra when she was 11, dining with her father and his associates from the age of 6, and spending her teenage years in the orbit of the glittering, morally complex world that the Havana and Las Vegas operations had built. Her account of her father is affectionate rather than analytical, shaped by the daughter's natural reluctance to assign full moral weight to a man she loved, and critics of the memoir noted that it disclosed relatively little about the actual mechanics of what Lansky did. What it did convey, to those reading against the grain of its protective instincts, was a portrait of a man who had built walls between the criminal world and the domestic one, and maintained them with considerable discipline across decades. The walls collapsed after his death. Lansky died of lung cancer on January 15, 1983, at Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami Beach. He was 80 years old, the same age that would have been assigned to him based on the July 4, 1902 birth date the immigration official had given him at Ellis Island when his mother could not provide the exact date. The estate he left behind was a matter of considerable family dispute and public curiosity. His biographer Robert Lacey concluded that the Cuba losses had effectively wiped out whatever personal fortune Lansky had accumulated, leaving him unable in his final years to fund the kind of private medical care that Buddy required. His step-granddaughter said that after Teddy died in 1997, she searched the apartment for some trace of the $300 million the FBI had estimated as his wealth in 1970, and found nothing that suggested it had ever been there. Sandra Lansky later said that at some point in the early 1970s, her father had transferred $15 million to Jake's control to conceal it from the IRS. A family member close to the estate suggested that after all the transfers, legal costs, and the Cuba losses, what remained at the time of his death was somewhere in the region of $57,000 in cash. Buddy outlived his father by 6 years, which was not the outcome that anyone who knew how central Buddy was to Lansky's emotional life would have predicted. He spent those 6 years in the Arch Creek convalescent home in Miami, living on county government resources, because whatever Lansky had arranged for his support had not survived the estate distribution process intact. Family members who had access to the inheritance that should have reached Buddy reportedly received a disproportionate share of what little was there. He was 59 years old and living virtually penniless in a government facility when his father had been one of the most financially powerful criminals in American history. The end came in December 1989. Buddy refused to eat. He refused to drink. He turned his face toward the wall of his room and kept it there. He died 2 days later of dehydration and starvation, with his face still toward the wall. He was buried at Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami, beside his father, under the flight path of El Al jets arriving from Israel into Miami International Airport. The grave where the man who had armed Israel's founding war and been rejected by its government lies buried is directly beneath the approach path of the planes connecting the country he loved to the city where he spent his last years. Meyer Lansky's footstone reads simply, his name and the dates, 1902 to 1983. A Star of David serves as the mark between them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, the private man behind the public criminal left an estate of almost nothing, and a son who died penniless in a county nursing home. Hollywood kept reaching for Lansky anyway, and kept getting him wrong in the same ways, for the same reasons. Section 8. The version they keep getting wrong. Shortly after The Godfather Part 2 premiered in December 1974, Meyer Lansky placed a telephone call to Lee Strasberg, the acting teacher and director who had played the character of Hyman Roth in the film. Lansky told Strasberg that he had watched the performance and found it good. Then he added a single complaint. Strasberg could have made him more sympathetic. He was, after all, a grandfather. The call has passed into the history of organized crime storytelling as one of its defining moments, partly because it is a perfect Lansky gesture. He watched a film built around a thinly disguised version of himself, assessed its accuracy in the detached way he assessed everything, registered one specific objection on the grounds not of what it got wrong about his criminal career, but of what it omitted about his humanity, and moved on. The objection was characteristically personal and characteristically precise. Roth in the film was a threat, a manipulator, an antagonist. Lansky in life was also those things, but he was other things the film had neither the space nor the narrative incentive to show. The Godfather Part 2 came out of the source material that Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola had assembled from the overlapping histories of American organized crime, and Roth's construction drew from several real figures while centering unmistakably on Lansky. The evidence is in the details. Roth's birth name in the film is Hyman Suchowski, a direct echo of Lansky's actual birth name Suchaljansky, compressed and slightly altered in the way that film adaptations reshape their sources. Roth's modest Miami home, where he sits in front of a television watching baseball and eating plain food while secretly controlling an empire, is one of the most accurate things the film ever shows. Lansky genuinely lived that way. A small, quiet apartment, a restrained domestic life. Nothing that would prompt a neighbor walking past to think twice about the man inside. The Cuba sequences in the film are the most historically grounded, which makes sense, because by the time The Godfather Part 2 was made, the mob's presence in Havana under Batista was one of the better documented episodes of American organized crime history. The New Year's Eve party at which Batista announces his departure, while the crime figures cut up a birthday cake that represents Cuba, each taking their slice before the whole thing dissolves, is the film's most elegant compression of what actually happened. In real life, Batista raised a toast and loaded cargo planes. The crime figures scrambled, the casinos closed in chaos. The film distills this into a single scene that captures the emotional reality of the night without being strictly accurate to any of its specifics. What the film cannot show, so because the film needs an antagonist, is the actual position Lansky occupied in relation to the Italian families. Roth in the film is the man orchestrating a conspiracy to destroy Michael Corleone, which positions him as a senior figure working against the Corleone family from a position of independence and authority. The historical Lansky was embedded within the syndicate structure in a way that was both more essential and more constrained than the film's framing allows. He was not above the families. He was not orchestrating against them. He managed money for them, held territory they needed to have managed, and operated with a degree of autonomy that reflected his indispensability rather than his formal authority. The Valachi testimony that surfaced in 1963 described a Lansky who was, in practice, a financial agent for the Genovese family, an arrangement in which, wherever Lansky operated, Genovese had an interest. That is a different kind of power from the one Roth exercises in the film. Real, enormous, but structured around service rather than sovereignty. Roth dies at the airport, shot by an assassin as he steps off a plane from Israel. Lansky arrived at Miami International Airport in 1972 from Israel, was arrested, stood trial for tax evasion, was acquitted, and then lived quietly in Florida for another decade before dying of lung cancer at 80 years old in his own bed. The difference between those two endings says something important about what the film needed and what the history provided. Drama requires resolution. Lansky's resolution was that he simply outlasted everything the government threw at him, which is not a satisfying narrative ending and does not translate neatly into a final scene. Al Pacino had suggested Lee Strasberg for the role, which means that Strasberg's two most famous students ended up in the same film on opposite sides of the central conflict. Pacino as Michael Corleone, Robert De Niro as the young Vito in the parallel storyline. Strasberg had founded the Actors Studio and was considered the father of method acting in America, and his late career turn as a criminal mastermind who disguises his menace behind a carefully constructed surface of geriatric normality was the best-received performance of his film career, earning him an Academy Award nomination. The casting was right in ways the screenplay couldn't fully exploit. Strasberg understood, as Lansky understood, that the most effective performance of power is often the one that makes the audience underestimate what it's watching. Barry Levinson's Bugsy, released in 1991, approached the Lansky story from the other direction, using Siegel as the center, and Lansky as the cautious, measured counterweight to Siegel's explosive volatility. Ben Kingsley played Lansky with a quiet intelligence that several critics found the film's most convincing performance, particularly given that the Lansky he was playing had to function mainly as the voice of restraint against Warren Beatty's romanticized Siegel. The texture of the relationship was reasonably accurate in its emotional logic. Lansky as the person who saw clearly where the operation was going wrong and lacked the authority to stop it, because stopping it would have meant stopping Siegel, and Siegel was not stoppable by any force short of the one that eventually was applied. The film's factual problems were numerous and substantial. Las Vegas in 1945 was not the small, slightly archaic frontier town the film depicts. The city already had legal casinos, several operating hotels, and a population that had been building steadily since gambling's legalization in 1931. The Hoover Dam, which the film's Siegel gestures toward as the coming catalyst for Las Vegas's growth, had been completed in 1936, 9 years before the Flamingo project began. More significantly, the Flamingo Hotel had been conceived and initially developed by a Hollywood entrepreneur named Billy Wilkerson, whose investment the film never acknowledges. Wilkerson broke ground on the project before Siegel's involvement, which means that neither the hotel's name nor its fundamental vision was the product of Siegel's singular desert epiphany, as the film's central myth requires. The Flamingo got its name from Wilkerson's original choice, not from Virginia Hill's supposed nickname, which the film implies was Siegel's loving tribute to his girlfriend. Siegel in the film is killed on Christmas night, the same night the Flamingo closed for emergency renovations after its disastrous opening. In reality, Siegel was shot in Beverly Hills on June 20, 1947, 6 months after the opening and well after the Flamingo had been reorganized under Gus Greenbaum and Mo Sedway. The film collapsed the timeline in service of narrative closure. The hotel fails. Siegel is immediately killed. The connection is obvious and emotionally satisfying. The actual sequence of events was messier, more prolonged, and less cinematically coherent. The Lansky that Bugsy needed was a supporting figure who could provide moral seriousness without upstaging its star. Kingsley delivered that with genuine skill. What Kingsley could not deliver, because the film did not ask him to, was any sense of the scale of what Lansky was actually doing during the same years the Flamingo Project was consuming Siegel's attention. By 1946, Lansky was simultaneously managing gambling operations in Florida and New Orleans, arranging the financial structure of the Havana Conference, beginning the laundering operations through Swiss accounts that would accumulate for the next 2 decades, and coordinating the intelligence relationship with the Office of Naval Intelligence that had been running since 1942. Bugsy shows the Lansky who worried about his friend. The real Lansky was running multiple large-scale operations at once, with the Flamingo as one investment among many, rather than the central project of his professional life. The HBO film from 1999, which also carried the title Lansky, and starred Richard Dreyfuss in the lead role from a script by David Mamet, attempted something more ambitious, an account of Lansky's entire arc as told through a framing device involving a fictional journalist interviewing the aging criminal in his final years. Mamet's dialogue gave Lansky aphorisms and reflections that were stylistically compelling without being particularly accurate to the kind of speech Lansky actually used, which was measured, private, and deliberately unremarkable. Dreyfuss brought energy and intelligence to the role, but was working against a structural problem that every Lansky film has faced. The framing device designed to produce revelations necessarily puts words in Lansky's mouth that the real Lansky spent his life making certain never appeared in any official record. The journalist elicits confessions. Lansky never confessed to anyone, and certainly not to journalists. The 2021 version, with Harvey Keitel in the role, and Keitel's considerable gravity as its primary reason for existing, repeated the same structural choice and suffered from the same fundamental problem. Critics noted that Keitel's performance was the film's main point of interest, which was generous but accurate. The film itself deployed aphorisms the way other crime films deploy shootings, as the primary unit of dramatic weight. Lansky says something wise about the nature of loyalty, or money, or ambition. The scene pauses for it to land. The audience is invited to appreciate the wry intelligence of a man who has seen everything. The historical Lansky was genuinely intelligent, and may well have thought in aphorisms, but he expressed those thoughts in private, to his wife, or to the very small number of people he trusted. Films that put his inner life on screen are, by definition, inventing it. The problem that runs through every screen version of Meyer Lansky is structural rather than performative. Good actors have played him. Good directors have tried to capture him. What no film has managed to resolve is that Lansky's method was specifically designed to be uncinematic. He did not give orders in rooms where they could be witnessed. He did not conduct dramatic confrontations that ended with someone dead in the street. He moved money through layers of entities that left no clear trail between him and the illegal activity that generated it. He lived simply, drew no attention to himself, and spent 50 years making sure that nothing he did in public gave any investigator the documentary hook that a film requires as its central dramatic fact. Goodfellas, the film this video essay invokes in its title, handles organized crime's financial architecture as backdrop rather than subject. Henry Hill's voiceover describes the skimming operations and the disbursement of cash from criminal enterprises in the same tone he uses to describe meals and loyalty, as a fact of the environment rather than as a revelation. The system Hill describes at street level is the system Lansky designed at the top: money taken before it's counted, moved through layers before it's recorded, distributed to people who never need to appear in any official document. Goodfellas shows what that system looked like from inside one of its many components. Lansky built the component factory. The Godfather Part 2 remained, of all the screen treatments, the one that best understood its own limitations. Coppola and Puzo were not trying to make a documentary. They took the texture of Lansky's world, the Cuba relationship, the quiet domestic exterior, the old man frailty that concealed ongoing lethality, the Israel episode, and assembled from those materials a character who served their larger story. What they could not do, working within the requirements of a narrative film, was show what made Lansky historically significant. Not any single dramatic act, but the cumulative, invisible, financially complex architecture that he constructed over 5 decades, and that the government never fully mapped even after his death. Lansky called Strasberg and said he could have been made more sympathetic. He was a grandfather. He was also a man who had helped organize 2 murders that restructured American organized crime, built a money laundering system that predated its legal definition, armed Israel's founding war while evading American taxes, and accumulated an estimated $300 million that the FBI never found. Sympathy was not the most obvious available response. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, every film missed the same thing, where the money actually went. The FBI estimated $300 million, the family found $57,000, and nobody has resolved the gap in the 4 decades since. Section 9. The $300 million nobody found. 6 months after Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer at Miami Beach in January 1983, a man named Vincent Allo, known for decades as Jimmy Blue Eyes, one of Lansky's longest-standing associates, appeared at the apartment on Collins Avenue to collect a debt Lansky had owed him. What Allo found there was some jewelry, a few stocks and bonds, and very little else. The apartment told the story of a man who had lived with deliberate modesty for the entire public portion of his life, which meant that finding almost nothing there was not itself evidence of much. Lansky had never maintained a visible lifestyle. He had never bought the house or the car or the boat that would have invited journalists to wonder where the money came from. The apartment on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach was the home of a retired accountant, not of a man the FBI had spent decades describing as one of the wealthiest organized crime figures in American history. Whether the apartment's emptiness meant that the wealth never existed, or that it existed somewhere else, in a form that no estate inventory could reach, is the question that has never been resolved. The $300 million figure that attached itself to Lansky's name was not a government calculation derived from forensic accounting. It originated with a journalist named Hank Messick, who had spent years pursuing Lansky and who published a biography in the early 1970s, making the claim that Lansky had squirreled away $300 million by the late 1960s. The FBI adopted the number, or something close to it, in its own assessments, and from there, it entered the public record as established fact in the way that repeated assertion sometimes achieves the status of documentation. Messick himself later backed away from the figure, but by then it had taken on a life independent of its source, recurring in congressional testimony, news coverage, and eventually the popular mythology of American organized crime. What makes the question genuinely unresolvable is that the wealth Lansky accumulated, if he accumulated it at the scale claimed, was specifically designed to leave no trace that would allow an audit from the outside. He moved money from casino floors through count rooms before it was formally recorded, through couriers to banking institutions in jurisdictions with secrecy protections, through shell companies whose beneficial ownership was separated by multiple layers from any name that appeared in an official document, and ultimately into accounts in Switzerland whose anonymity the 1934 Banking Act had codified into law. The FBI could infer the existence of the money from the scale of the operations Lansky managed, from informant testimony about percentages and fees, and from the general logic of what a financial manager charging a cut of the syndicate's revenues over several decades should have accumulated. What the FBI could never do was open an account in Zurich and find his name on it, because his name was not on it, and neither was any name that could be connected to him through available legal process. The Bahamas represented the first serious attempt to rebuild after Cuba. Lansky had begun laying groundwork in the islands even before Castro's forces reached Havana, and within months of the Cuban nationalization, he had identified the Bahamas as the next available jurisdiction with a cooperative political class and proximity to the American tourist market. By the early 1960s, casino operations on Grand Bahama Island and Paradise Island were generating revenues that helped replace some of what Cuba had cost. The specific operators running the floor-level operations in the Bahamas were men from Lansky's existing network, the same people who had run the Cuban casinos, relocated to a new geography under similar arrangements. The political infrastructure required in the Bahamas differed from Cuba's in its particulars, but not in its basic structure: money to the people who mattered, in amounts calculated to produce the specific protections the operation needed. London came at roughly the same time. The Colony Sports Club in London's Mayfair district opened in the early 1960s as a licensed gambling establishment operating under British law, run through frontmen that included the actor George Raft, whose Hollywood associations and public persona provided the kind of celebrity credibility that attracted wealthy clients who might otherwise have found the establishment's owners' backgrounds off-putting. Lansky and Philadelphia crime family boss Angelo Bruno held the actual interests. The British licensing authorities eventually revoked the colony's license when investigators pieced together who was actually behind the operation, but by then, the club had generated substantial revenues and demonstrated that the post-Cuba expansion could work in European markets as well. The operations in the Bahamas, London, and the ongoing Las Vegas skimming produced revenues through the 1960s. The IRS and FBI estimates from this period acknowledged as much. The 300 million figure was cited as Lansky's holdings by 1970, not as a pre-Cuba peak. If the estimate had any basis in the underlying operations, it reflected wealth accumulated across 4 decades of activity rather than a single concentrated period, much of it moving through jurisdictions that American investigators had no legal mechanism to access. The competing interpretation, which Lansky's most serious biographer advanced, begins from a different set of observable facts. Robert Lacey spent years researching the authorized biography that was published in 1991, gaining access to people who knew Lansky directly, to court records, to FBI files, and to the financial records that existed in forms that could be examined. Lacey's conclusion was striking. After the Cuba losses, Lansky would have had trouble accounting for assets that stretched as far as $3 million in readily accessible form, let alone $300 million. The biography's account of Lansky's later years described a man who was genuinely financially strained, who could not afford the kind of private medical care that Buddy's condition required, who was living on a modestly diminished scale that was not entirely an act. Lacey's assessment was that the myth of Lansky's $300 million had been built on inference and reputation rather than traceable fact, and that the actual money had been substantially smaller, had peaked well before the Cuba losses, and had been largely destroyed by the combination of Castro's nationalization and the legal costs and financial disruptions of the 1970s prosecutions. Buddy Lansky's situation provided the most uncomfortable evidence for Lacey's position. Buddy had talked to a reporter from the Associated Press in 1989, 6 years after his father's death, about the will and the trust that was supposed to provide for his care. He said his father had told him he would be taken care of. He said the money had dried up. He asked, in a way that did not sound like performance, where all the money had gone. The AP report found him living in a county government nursing home, dependent on public resources, the eldest son of the man the FBI had estimated as worth $300 million, dying in circumstances that left him penniless. A man who could have accessed hidden offshore wealth of any meaningful size would not have let that happen. Sandra Lansky added a specific figure to the public record in 2010, when she said that at some point in the early 1970s, her father had transferred approximately $15 million to Jake's control to conceal it from the IRS during the period when the tax evasion charges were active. $15 million in the early 1970s was substantial money, though it was far from the $300 million the FBI claimed. It was also money that, by Sandra's account, had been moved specifically to avoid being found, which meant that its subsequent location was not something she could specify. Jake Lansky died in September 1983, 8 months after his brother. Whether the $15 million moved with him into his own estate, was dispersed to others, or disappeared into accounts nobody has since mapped, is not something the available record answers. The FBI's failure to find the money during the 18-year surveillance operation from the early 1950s to 1971 does not by itself prove the money did not exist. It proves that the FBI could not find it using the investigative tools available to them in that era, which is a different statement. Lansky had been moving money into Swiss accounts since at least 1932, decades before the FBI's organized crime investigations began in earnest. He had purchased a Swiss bank through which to route the transactions. The accounts were numbered rather than named. The Swiss banking secrecy laws of the period made American legal process against those accounts effectively impossible. An investigator could know with certainty that the money was in Switzerland and still have no legal mechanism for retrieving it or even confirming its existence in a form admissible in court. What happened to accounts at Swiss banks when no authorized person with knowledge of the account numbers continued to exist is not publicly documented for the specific case of Lansky's holdings. Swiss banking law in that era generally provided that accounts with no activity and no heir making a claim would eventually be absorbed by the institution, though the precise legal mechanisms and timelines varied. If Lansky had accumulated significant wealth in Swiss accounts and arranged for that wealth to be accessible only through knowledge of account numbers and verification procedures that he maintained personally, then his death at 80 years old in a Miami Beach apartment would have ended the chain of access. The accounts, if they existed, would have sat with no one to claim them. This is not the only possibility. Lansky may have arranged successors. He may have transferred access to Thelma, who survived him by 14 years, or to others in his network whose names do not appear in the public record of his estate. The $15 million Sandra described moving to Jake might have been only the portion she knew about, with other transfers happening through channels she was not informed of. The FBI's biographer who investigated what Lansky's estate actually contained, going through the safe deposit box and other accessible records after his death, reported finding no photo of J. Edgar Hoover in address, no Swiss account numbers, and no obvious path to the wealth that had been attributed to him. The contents of the safe deposit box were unremarkable in the way that everything Lansky maintained in the visible portion of his existence was unremarkable. The three positions available to anyone reviewing the evidence are these. The first holds that Lansky accumulated something close to the FBI's estimate through 5 decades of managing syndicate finances, that the Cuba losses were real but survivable, that the Bahamas and London operations rebuilt a portion of what was lost, and that the money exists somewhere in accounts whose access chains are now broken, or whose beneficiaries have maintained the same discretion Lansky maintained for his entire career. The second holds that Robert Lacey was essentially right, that the Cuba losses were catastrophic, that the $300 million was always an inference built on operational scale, rather than traceable assets, and that the man who died in January 1983 had genuinely run out of money in the decade before his death. The third holds that both positions contain partial truth, that Lansky had been enormously wealthy at points in his career, that the Cuba losses reduced that wealth dramatically, that some portion of what remained was successfully hidden in jurisdictions that never cooperated with American investigators, but that the scale of the hidden portion was substantially smaller than the mythology required. None of the three can be proven or eliminated with the available evidence. This is the point. Lansky spent his entire career making certain that questions about his money could not be resolved by examining his records. The wealth, whatever its actual scale, was designed to be unaccountable. After his death, that design continued to function exactly as intended, because the people who might have had the specific technical knowledge needed to access whatever existed were themselves dead, and the institutions that held whatever existed had no obligation to report it to anyone who came looking. The journalist who had spent years investigating him offered what has become the most quoted assessment of what Lansky ultimately was. He did not own property, he owned people. If that was accurate, then what died in January 1983 was the person who maintained the relationships through which the invisible empire operated, and without that person, the empire simply ceased to be accessible. The money, if it was there, stopped being Lansky's money on the day he died. Whose money it became after that, nobody has found a way to establish. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, $300 million, or $3 million, or something in between. What the full arc of Lansky's life actually reveals goes well beyond the money, and it is considerably colder than any film has been willing to show. Section 10. What the real story actually reveals. There was a notebook in the desk drawer of Meyer Lansky's Miami Beach apartment, and in it he had written a sentence he apparently kept there as a private instruction to himself. Take the responsibility on your shoulders, and it will leave no room for chips. The sentence was not addressed to anyone. It was not a boast or a manifesto. It was the working philosophy of a man who had spent 60 years conducting himself in exactly that spirit. The notebook was found after his death. The estate was worth $57,000 on paper, and the FBI believed $300 million existed somewhere else, and neither the FBI nor his own family could locate a dollar of it. What the apartment contained, beyond the notebook and the jewelry and the modest furnishings of a retired man of modest visible means, was essentially no evidence that anything Lansky had spent his life building had ever existed in a form that could be found in a desk drawer in Miami Beach. The architecture he constructed across 5 decades was designed for exactly this outcome. The notebook sentence was its founding principle. Put everything on your own shoulders, hold it there, and give no one anything that could later be used as a chip against you. The institutional response to what Lansky built arrived in stages. And the timing of those stages is the most revealing thing about how far ahead of his legal environment he operated throughout his career. He began moving criminal proceeds into Swiss accounts in 1932. The Bank Secrecy Act, which introduced the first serious American legal requirements around financial reporting and record-keeping, designed to trace money of the kind Lansky moved, was not passed until 1970, the same year he fled to Israel. The Money Laundering Control Act, which made money laundering itself a standalone federal crime for the first time, was passed in 1986, 3 years after he died. The legal architecture that would have most directly addressed the methods he had been using for 50 years arrived too late to apply to him in any meaningful way. He preceded the law. This is not a coincidence of timing. The Bank Secrecy Act was passed in direct response to the problem that Lansky's career had demonstrated at scale, that criminal organizations could generate enormous amounts of money and make that money effectively invisible by routing it through financial institutions in jurisdictions where American legal process had no reach. The congressional testimony that supported the act drew on organized crime investigations that had been building since the Kefauver hearings of 1950 and 1951, and the specific techniques those investigations had identified were the techniques Lansky had standardized. The law was written with his methods in mind, and passed the year he decided the country had become too dangerous to remain in. The Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 criminalized what Lansky had spent his career doing, knowingly engaging in financial transactions designed to conceal the criminal origin of funds. The act carried significant penalties and gave federal prosecutors tools for pursuing financial crimes that had not previously existed in American law. If that act had existed in 1932, when Lansky opened his first Swiss accounts, or in 1934, when the Swiss banking secrecy law gave those accounts their protection, the entire architecture of American organized crime's financial operations would have faced a fundamentally different legal environment from its beginning. It did not exist, because governments tend to build the law in response to problems that have already been demonstrated, rather than problems that are being constructed in real time. What Lansky understood, and what his entire career expressed, was that law follows behavior with a significant lag. The behavior exists, generates results, demonstrates its profitability, and its resistance to existing enforcement, and only then produces the regulatory and legal response. By the time the response arrives, the person who pioneered the behavior has had decades of advantage, and the methods have been refined and distributed to enough practitioners that eliminating the original is purely symbolic. The Bank Secrecy Act did not end offshore money laundering. The Money Laundering Control Act did not eliminate the practice Lansky had normalized. They changed the landscape for the people who came after him, and created new legal risks that his successors had to navigate. But the fundamental architecture he had demonstrated was possible, continued to be used by criminal organizations operating in the same jurisdictions with the same basic logic he had applied in the 1930s. The FBI agent who assessed Lansky's career for the New York Times obituary in January 1983 did so with what the paper called grudging admiration, suggesting that if Lansky had gone into legitimate business, he would have been chairman of the board of General Motors. The comment is extraordinary in context. An agent of the bureau that had spent 20 years trying to prosecute the man assessed his capacities against the benchmark of one of the largest corporations in the world and found Lansky the superior. The assessment was not about honesty or morality. It was about organizational intelligence, the ability to understand how large, complex enterprises function, to build structures that survive individual components failing, to keep the relationship between visible activity and invisible wealth opaque across multiple jurisdictions and multiple decades. By that measure, which is the only measure an FBI agent reviewing 50 years of evasion could honestly apply, the assessment was probably accurate. The arc that the real Meyer Lansky story traces is not the arc that the film versions have consistently tried to impose on it. Films require rise and fall, ambition and consequence, power and its price. They require Hyman Roth to be shot at the airport, because a man who helped build the architecture of American organized crime should not be permitted to simply die of lung cancer in his own bed after 80 years. The demand for proportionality runs deep in how audiences receive stories about criminal careers. The crime should cost something commensurate with its scale. The violence should be repaid with violence. The wealth should be lost, or the freedom should be lost, or something should be extracted from the person who extracted so much from others. Lansky's life does not deliver that. He never lost his freedom for longer than 2 months, on a gambling charge in 1953 in Saratoga Springs. He was acquitted of the tax evasion charges that represented the most serious prosecution his career attracted. The other indictments were abandoned because of his health. He died at 80 years old in a hospital, surrounded by family, of a disease unrelated to his criminal career. His wife survived him. His children survived him. The grandchildren went on with their lives. The institutional reckoning that the films need to provide, because the legal system failed to provide it, never arrived. What did arrive, as a consequence of what Lansky built and represented, was a set of structural changes in how both criminal organizations and legitimate financial institutions operated. The national crime syndicate he helped design in the early 1930s transformed American organized crime from a collection of ethnically segregated street operations into something that functioned, in its best years, with the structure of a corporation, territorial divisions, profit-sharing agreements, dispute resolution mechanisms, and centralized financial management. That transformation made American organized crime more profitable, more durable, and more resistant to prosecution than any of its predecessors had been. The families that emerged from that restructuring survived for decades after the people who built it were dead. The financial methods he pioneered became the template not just for the American organized crime that came after him, but for a broader category of sophisticated financial criminal that had not previously existed in the form he created. The 3 elements of his system, separating the person who generates criminal income from the documented beneficiary of that income through layers of shell entities, using jurisdictions with strong secrecy protections as the transit point for funds, and maintaining a personal lifestyle so unremarkable that no visible wealth exists to be traced, became the blueprint for drug cartel financial management, for the illicit wealth movement of corrupt foreign officials, and eventually for the offshore structures that sophisticated financial criminals of all kinds continued to build well into the 21st century. The methods did not originate with Lansky in every case, but he demonstrated that they could be applied at scale to criminal proceeds over a sustained period without producing successful prosecution, and that demonstration was the model. What the real story reveals about Lansky himself, separate from his institutional legacy, is a set of ironies that no film version has fully confronted. He was more powerful than most of the Italian bosses he served, in the functional sense that his skills were harder to replace and his knowledge was more comprehensive, but he could never be formally acknowledged within the structure he had helped build, because the rules of that structure excluded him by ethnicity. He loved Israel deeply enough to arm its founding war at personal risk and financial cost, and Israel refused to let him stay. He wanted his sons to live legitimate lives and achieve that ambition in Paul's military career while watching Buddy's disability undermine everything else. He built structures to protect money and could not protect the most vulnerable person in his immediate family from dying penniless in a county nursing home. The loyalty that organized crime mythology treats as its central value was, in Lansky's actual career, almost entirely one-directional. He was loyal to Luciano across 5 decades, to Siegel until the moment Siegel made continuation impossible, to the syndicate's interests over his own personal preferences when those 2 things came into conflict. What the syndicate, the government, and the state of Israel provided in return for his loyalty was instrumental and transactional. They took what he could give when they needed it, and denied him what he needed when the cost of providing it became inconvenient. 3 separate institutions made that calculation in 3 separate contexts, and the outcome was the same each time. The real story is worse than the Goodfellas, in the specific way that the title of this video essay promises. Goodfellas is a film about the consequences of ambition, about men who reach for something they cannot sustain, and pay the price in violence, imprisonment, and betrayal. Henry Hill goes into witness protection. Jimmy Conway kills everyone who might implicate him. The mob, as the film depicts it, is self-defeating. Its own internal logic eventually destroys the people who live inside it. Lansky's career does not fit that template. The man at the center of the real version of the story did not pay a price proportionate to his role. He outlasted his partners, his prosecutors, his enemies, and most of his friends. He died in a hospital at 80 years old, with a Star of David on the headstone that would stand over his grave at Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami, under the flight path of El Al jets connecting the country he had armed and been rejected by to the city where he had lived for decades, while the government tried and failed to account for what he had done. An FBI agent assessed him as a General Motors chairman who had taken the wrong road. His daughter described unexpected tenderness. His son said the money had dried up and asked where it had all gone. His biographer concluded the Cuba losses had left almost nothing. His other son graduated West Point and served Vietnam and named his own son after him. He kept a notebook in his desk that said to take the responsibility on your shoulders and leave no room for chips. He did exactly that, and the room left nothing to find. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.